All right, guys, welcome back. We're going to be doing another tier lists today. Today, we're going to be looking at U.S. violations of international law throughout their history. But before we get into it, I'd like to thank, first of all, my sponsor, NordVPN, because NordVPN is literally the best and allows me to hide all of the shady stuff I do on the internet. So you should definitely get it. Also, you could, before we start, how about you hit that like button and absolutely demolish that subscribe button right now. Right now, you better do it. Okay, let's go on to the the video. Oh yeah. Okay, so first of all, we're gonna go through these first two pretty quickly because there are a lot of them, and it is area of international law where there wasn't much like regulation at the time or much accountability because it was early or it was committed on the US population. So we're mostly going to be looking at international campaigns, which the US has um, participated in and acted as an aggressor in. But to start, we're going to go on to the indigenous violations of indigenous rights, and these are obvious violations of international law for multiple reasons, including civilian deaths, but also interfering in like another quote unquote nation's elections and affairs. So there are several violations here, but we're just going to go through this list really quick and then figure out where on the tier list it goes. So first of all, we're going to talk about there's tons of treaties the U.S. has signed and subsequently violated with indigenous groups. We're talking about like things like the Dawes Act, where the land that was allotted to the indigenous people was basically either repealed or violated by the settlers. Also, while we're here, we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears in 1831. This was Andrew Jackson's attempt to absolutely get rid of all of the indigenous peoples of the South, and it mostly worked because they all went to Oklahoma, and there are very few indigenous people who remain in the South after the Trail of Tears. On to the next one, a little bit less known. In 1864, there was the Sand Creek Massacre, where Colorado cavalry ignored a surrender flag and murdered a group of mainly women, children, and elderly Arapaho and Cheyenne indigenous people. On to 1872, another massacre, the Skeleton Cave Massacre, where around 100 Yavapai indigenous people murdered by the U.S. Army in an attempt to force them onto a reservation. Again, in 1890, this is probably the more famous one, the Wounded Knee Massacre, where almost 300 Lakota indigenous people were massacred by the U.S. Army. And given all of these and all of the ones that I haven't mentioned, because the U.S. has kind of done a bad job at like covering it up, but for the most part has normalized it, we're going to give this a solid B rating because it's, they did a pretty good job of normalizing the actions that the US has done to indigenous peoples, but people still know about the crimes they've committed. On to the next point, we're going to be looking at US violations of international law against their own people. We're talking about massacres committed by the government here, and these also we're going to go through pretty quick. So, starting off right away in 1887, the Thibodaux massacre, where 30 to 60 striking black workers were murdered by the Louisiana militia and a white mob. Again, in 1897, the Latimer massacre, where 19 mostly immigrant mine workers in Pennsylvania were murdered by the Luzerne County Sheriff Department. Then in 1914, the Ludlow Massacre, where National Guard aided in terrorism by business interests against striking mine workers in Colorado. Basically, do not work in the mines if you are living before like 1920. Then in 1919, the Elaine Massacre, where 67 black farmers in Arkansas were charged, as well as 12 sentenced to death after a white mob attacked them as they were striking. So, again, this is another example of people striking and then getting murdered and or falsely accused. So this is kind of a big red flag for striking. On to the 1937 Ponce Massacre. You probably don't know about this one because it was in Puerto Rico, where police murdered 19 and wounded over 200. Sorry, in response to a peaceful march in Ponce, Puerto Rico. Then that same year, in 1937, Memorial Day Massacre, where Chicago police murdered 10 unarmed strikers. What a great move from the Chicago police because nobody remembers it. 1968 now. We're talking about the Orangeburg Massacre, where police in South Carolina murdered 3 and injured almost 30 peaceful student protesters. But in 1970, the more famous massacre at Kent State, the Kent State Massacre, where 4 protesting students murdered by the police, and you can see one of these in the photo here. This is of the dead person right there on the ground with the lady next to him, and that is the Kent State Massacre. On to 1985, the Move Massacre. Philadelphia police dropped a C4 charge on the Move organization headquarters, killing 11. And obviously, this was unwarranted, and there was no need to involve weapons or aggressive force. And the next one is ongoing. We're talking about the border crisis, where hundreds of immigrants are held in detestable conditions in immigration detention centers. This one because the US has done not that much damage compared to their other actions, and a lot of people know about at least one of these. We are going to rate this as a solid C because they have done a lot of damage and most of them are relatively unacknowledged. But the fact that they are like acknowledged at all, and the fact that people recognize that the US has the capacity to commit these crimes against humanity just goes to show that they aren't very good at covering up their shitty actions. On to the next points. We're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War and the imperialism that the U.S. employed in the wake of it. First of all, in Hawaii, this was mostly a private venture by businessmen who were farming sugarcane on the Hawaiian Islands. So this is mostly not involving the U.S., but they backed it, and they also annexed Hawaii later. So this one is definitely going to go in as a solid D because a lot of people do not care about the fact that the US definitely like annexed independent island, which is a clear violation of international law because it's interfering in the affairs of another country. And so because this was mostly not the US government, I can't give it any higher than a D, unfortunately. Also, during the Spanish-American War, or around that time, was the Panama Canal. This was Theodore Roosevelt's big thing. He loved the canal and he really wanted to build it. So basically, he like coerced Panama and didn't care about what they wanted. And he built the Panama Canal, and this is kind of okay, maybe, because now it's pretty important that the Panama Canal is there, but the US was not the greatest around it, and um it also was established that the U.S. was backing an uprising in 1903 against the Colombian government in order to have a government that would allow them to build this canal. And since this has mostly turned out well, and U.S. people do not really care that the U.S. has committed a lot of harm in building the canal, we're going to do this as a solid A tier. So good job, U.S. there. Oh my God. And next, in the Spanish-American War, we can also talk about the Philippines. That's what this picture is. Um, this picture is showing. So this is about the Philippine-American War, where the U.S. kind of turned their back on the Philippines after getting them independence from Spain and annexed them and committed tons of war crimes and mass murder of civilians. And we're going to rate this as a solid A tier as well because the US people do not really care about the Philippines and do not know that the United States was involved in the mass murder of many civilians in the Philippines. On to the next one. This is about Nicaragua and specifically the United Fruit Company that was operating in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, the Theodore Roosevelt administration backed a takeover of the government to establish a government that was sympathetic to U.S. business interests. And basically, this was brutal in the end because it resulted in a pro-US Somoza dictatorship, which wreaked terror on Nicaraguans for another few decades, which is kind of horrible. But again, people do not really know about this case, and since a lot of the damage done by the US actions here were not direct, but rather indirect in the following years after they installed this ruthless dictator, this has also got to go as an A. It's not quite perfect, but it's pretty close there, guys. On to the next one. We're looking at the US's Wilsonian imperialism. During around the same time, maybe a decade later, Woodrow Wilson was involved in lots of imperialism. In this, he established a government in Cuba. This was also where Guantanamo Bay came from because he coerced the Cuban government after they were free from the Spanish government to give the US a naval base. And the US would use Guantanamo Bay like 100 years later, and we can talk about that more in a little bit. But this picture represents Woodrow Wilson's general meddling in other countries' affairs during his period as president. And for those reasons, we're going to be placing this one as a solid B because he didn't necessarily wreak as much direct havoc as some of the other things the US has done. But again, people do not care about his involvement in countries like Haiti and Cuba, um, as well as the Dominican Republic. And oh, I forgot to mention that involved in this Theodore Roosevelt time period of imperialism, the US also took over Puerto Rico and Guam during the Spanish-American War. So this period around Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt was big for US international law violations. So good job on them because those all rated pretty well on our tier list. Next, we're going to be talking about the Port of Veracruz occupation that the U.S. attempted on Mexico. This was an attempted attack on Mexico, which went pretty horribly for the U.S. It was actually pretty embarrassing. So what happened is that the US decided that they wanted to attack Mexicans and they killed 126 Mexicans in an attempt to gain control over Mexico and their oil, but ultimately it kind of failed. So this one we're definitely not going to rate well. This is a solid D tier. This couldn't be rated higher because it's kind of a really bad moment for the US, and even though nobody remembers it, the US kind of failed, so they suck. Next, we're going to be talking about the US involvement in Iran to take over the government after the Iran government nationalized their oil, which the US was not okay with. And what they did was they took away the democratically elected leader and they replaced him with a dictator who would wreak havoc on the Iranian citizens for years to come. And because this was very successful for the United States for a long time before the Iranians started hating the US's guts. We're going to rate this as a B tier because this was a successful meddling in other people's countries and people don't really know about it. So solid B tier there. Oh, and that was in 1953, just so you know, guys. All right, we're not going directly in order, but that's fine. Next is the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which people like to argue are necessary, but probably were not, according to experts. But Because people generally condone these attacks, even though it killed over 100,000 civilians, we are going to rate this as a solid A because these are mostly recognized as heroic from the US, even though it resulted in the killing of more than 100,000 civilians in a completely probably mostly unnecessary action, and definitely violated international law by killing civilians who were not involved in the battles. Next, we're going to be talking about Korea. Here, after the US was involved in the Korean War and separated North Korea into South Korea and North Korea, um, they installed pro-US governments, but did not care if they were dictators or not. So they ended up installing a dictator, and the dictators continued to run um, South Korea for a long time, and this is also compiled by the fact that the US was constantly baiting and still is being aggressive towards North Korea, which is not necessarily the will of the South Korean quote unquote allies over there in East Asia. Because of this, because it's not that significant compared to other crimes, this is the C tier because it just doesn't rate up to some of the other horrible things that the US has done. All right, on to the next one. Next, we're talking about Cuba Cuba situation during the Kennedy administration. So, first of all, here, this was Fidel Castro. There were six assassination attempts attempted on him, none of which were successful. The US kind of sucked at interfering in Cuba's affairs. So, this one definitely has to be an F tier. And I'm sorry about the F tier US, but you just didn't do well with this one. And along the same vein is our next photo as well, which is the Bay of Pigs, which was a complete failure because US tried to run a covert operation where they painted their aircraft the color of I mean not Vietnamese, I meant to say Cuban aircraft, but then people definitely knew that they were US planes, so it totally revealed that the US was doing shady stuff. And it ended up being a complete failure because Castro knew about it and completely avoided the overthrowing of him and installment of another government. So this one, unfortunately, we're also going to have to give an F tier to. Sorry, guys. On to the next one. This is Vietnam. So right here is bombings on Vietnam. There were bombings by the US on South Vietnam, which was their ally, and this killed like many civilians. And the this was carried out through operations like Operation Rolling Thunder, where the US just indiscriminately bombed Vietnamese land, but most people don't care about it. And this specific action didn't elicit tons of, um, protests from the US people. So this is a solid C tier because the US was semi-successful in pretending that they did nothing wrong. And for the most part, people accepted that, but not completely, as was seen by protests to the Vietnam War, although those were mostly about other soldiers getting conscripted. On to the next. We're talking about napalm during the Vietnam War. Now, this is a clear violation of international law because it's a chemical weapon, and this was unnecessary to be used, but the US was involved in napalm warfare, which leaves horrible burns on the people who get affected by it and attacked with it. And this was a clear war crime by the United States because it was um, used against civilians and other soldiers alike. Either way, it's a compounding US violation of international law. And because people kind of know about this, but for the most part do not, this is going to go as an A because it's a clear weapons violation that the US got away with for the most part. On to the next one, Operation Menu. This was another Vietnam War era thing that the US did that was pretty shitty. Okay, so basically they bombed Cambodia, which was unnecessary because they were a neutral nation, and this was kind of a covert operation by the Nixon administration, who did not care that much and were involved in, things that weren't necessary and definitely were violent. And people don't know about Operation Menu that much, so this one's definitely going to get a high rating for me. We're we're gonna put this in the A range because the US definitely got away with one here because killing, thousands of civilians in a completely unnecessary bombing without getting held accountable is definitely a W move from the United States of America. On to the next one, the My Lai massacre. This was a U.S. killing of tons of civilians who were murdered by U.S. soldiers, and this was again completely unnecessary that the U.S. government committed this, and this is one of the most well-known violations of international law by the United States, specifically in the Vietnam War, and this definitely didn't accomplish anything for the U.S. But today it's pretty much put under the rug. So for that reason, it's going to get a D because it did a decent amount of destruction against innocent people, but it's also slightly recognized today. On to the next one. This is the Reagan imperialism era. So first of all, this is the Libya bombings. This was where the U.S. Committed bombings, killing tens of civilians using things like car bombs, and it created a list of casualties which weren't necessary and was also part of an attempt to control the government in Libya. And so this was definitely a violation of international law, not just because they were interfering in the affairs of Libya, but also because they were casually killing civilians. And because this is not well known in the slightest, we're going to move this into the S tier. So good job, Libya bombing in 1986 for getting the S tier. What the Reagan administration was not done. Look at this cute little photo of him saying, "Stop communism, Central America." And this was like a reference to his imperialism and actions in uh, Central America, such as overthrowing the Nicaraguan government for again, because the US just loves meddling in Latin America. But he also was involved in overthrows and coups and interference in other countries such as Grenada, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Um, so these actions are mostly not really cared about by the US public today. So these are definitely going to get a high rating here. Reagan administration got away with this, and he even looks kind of cute in this photo. So yet again, Reagan takes the S tier for this one because the US committed a wide range of violations of international law and also were involved in the installment of several dictatorships in Central America without accountability. So good job on the US for not getting held accountable for that. Moving on to the next one, this is Operation Just Cause. This was an unnecessary operation, and which was justified by saying that this person that the US was looking for, who had committed crimes, was in Panama. So the US invaded Panama because obviously you need to invade to be able to find this guy. And also, this is another reason that the US has um, they definitely did not just want to get this guy, especially since a lot of the crimes that he committed were while he was on the CIA payroll. But the US definitely got away with this one and were involved in covert actions in Panama during Christmas time. So this is kind of a triple whammy. However, the damage it caused was not so significant. And for that reason, we're going to put it in A tier because it's a good job by the US, but it's not everything. All right. Next, we're looking at the 1999 Kosovo bombings. These were bombings carried out by NATO to reportedly, protect human rights from the Serbs, but it ended up that the worst human rights abuses committed by the Serbians were committed post-bombing. So basically, the bombings incited the worst human rights violations, and they were involved in the direct killing of many civilians. But the US and NATO definitely got away with this one because people generally condone this, even though it's a clear violation of international law for multiple reasons. But because the US is somewhat known for this and NATO was also involved, i.e., the US didn't do it all alone, we're going to have to give this a B tier. I'm sorry, but Kosovo just doesn't deserve the A tier because it just doesn't match up with some of the other actions that the US has done that are listed there. On to the next one. Here we're talking about US Middle East campaigns. This is a lot more modern, and this will involve a few different things. We're going to start, first of all, with Iraq. This was the Iraq War, which was, again, probably the most well-known US operation that was completely unnecessary. They claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but there really weren't, and it's pretty clear that the US knew that at the time, but didn't care because they had interests in Iraq that they needed to take hold of. But was largely condoned at the time by the US public because they were getting fed lies about Iraq by people like Colin Powell and George Bush. So this was definitely condoned and was an action that the US committed that resulted in the killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians and also the indirect poverty and famine in those communities. So this was a massive amount of damage, but it's also offset by the amount of coverage and knowledge that people have about it now, and the fact that it is generally not supported by the US, people today. So for those reasons, it's going to be a C, just because the massive casualties make it such a big thing for the US to do without really getting held accountable, but people still know about it and aren't crazy happy about it. Next, we're talking about Afghanistan, where there are a lot of civilian casualties, which are completely unnecessary. Again, this is US interfering in another country in the name of like promoting US democracy and keeping terrorists at bay. But these kind of excuses for committing international law violations are ripe without through history of the US doing this. So this is not really an excuse. They also use communism as a way to commit international law violations, but Afghanistan is largely condoned, and it's also resulted in like a lot. It was also caused largely by the US, since they were the ones who armed the people in Afghanistan, such as the Taliban, who have those weapons. But people don't really care about that. And for those reasons, we're going to put it up here in the A tier because it's largely successful, but the amount of civilian deaths just doesn't match up to some of the other US actions. On to the next one. This is the 2011 Libya attacks. This was a operation by NATO where they sought to overthrow Libya's government. And yet again, this is another example of violations of international law by the United States. This Libya attack was unnecessary and uncalled for by NATO, and it was in the name of human rights and kind of maybe took care of some human rights violations, given that the previous dictator was um, pretty brutal and committed a lot of violations. And because this was somewhat of a necessary action that the US took and NATO, along with NATO, it's going to be rated a little bit lower because the US definitely maybe could have not done this and saved lots of casualties of civilians in which wouldn't have been harmed if the US had been more careful about how they handled protecting the Libyan citizens and maybe leaving their own. But this is a controversial subject, and for those reasons, I'm going to put it at C so that nobody gets mad at me. On to the next one. This next one is the Obama and Trump actions in Syria, specifically the missile attacks that they uh, went against that Syria, especially after the Gaddafi the president of Syria was involved in chemical warfare, and the U.S. response to that was to indiscriminately fire missiles at Syria, killing civilians. So this was a bad response to a already horrible situation, and this was present during both the Obama and Trump administrations, where they were involved in the intervention in places like Syria. But because this is more modern day, this didn't really do much. The US couldn't do much about what was happening in Syria, so it was pretty ineffective and also received some bad press despite being mostly ignored by the US population. For that reason, we're going to give it a solid D because it's just not quite on the same scale, even though it killed a bunch of people and was mostly ignored. It's just like comparatively, we're talking it was permissible, and not that bad. All right, next we're talking about drone strikes. These have been apparent through the last three administrations. Obama, Trump, and Biden were all involved in drone strikes in places like Yemen, where they were supposed to be taking out like terror individuals, but this was really not the case. So this was a clear violation of international law because, first of all, it's meddling in other affairs, and second of all, it resulted in civilian casualties, which were completely avoidable and unnecessary. Since these were met with a little bit more pushback from journalists and people around, this is going to get a lower rating, as well as the relatively low amount of damage it had done to populations given other attacks that the US has participated in. And for those reasons, it's going to be solidly in the C range. Finally, we're going to look at some of the stuff that the US has condoned and backed. First of all, I don't have a picture for this or a discussion point, but Guantanamo Bay was turned into a prison camp for so-called terrorists in which people who were not even necessarily um, involved with any terrorist groups were subject to torture and were not given trials. So this was an absolute win from the United States government on that front. However, it was met with pretty critical response. So they didn't do that well. If I had to rate it, I would probably give it a C. All right. This next one is about Turkey. The US, it has been allies with Turkey given their position in NATO. This is also an action by Europe because collectively the West basically ignores the fact that Turkey is oppressing their Kurdish minority and chooses to ignore it in favor of just like, you know, being friends with Turkey. And since most people really do not care about this, this is a pretty solid one for the United States. However, they are still not terribly involved in this, so we're going to give it a C rating. Finally, we're on to the last one. This is the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and this has been happening for pretty much the last 75 years. And the US has repeatedly backed Israel in actions that were definitely not defendable, such as chemical warfare, such as white phosphorus that the Israeli government used, as well as settlement on Palestinian land. And this is another controversial subject for no reason, and this is pretty personal to me. And for that reason, this is definitely going to rank pretty high because people liked it a lot, and people definitely like the fact that the US is participating and funding a modern form of settler colonialism. So good job, US, for getting away with that. But people are still somewhat critical for those reasons, it's gonna get an A rating. All right, we're done. That is the final tier list of US violations of international law. These were not all of them. There's a massive list of other US interference in other countries and things like that, but we don't have time for that today. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter, and you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment and maybe even upvote if you're a real one. All right, goodbye, guys. This is great. Bye bye.